Marcus Richardson leaned back in his leather office chair, the one his daughter had gifted him last Father's Day, and held up the cream-colored letter that would change everything. The evening sun streamed through his home office window, casting a warm glow on the family photos that lined his desk. 20 years of police work, countless solved cases, and community programs had led to this moment, his appointment as the new police chief of Millbrook Police Department. His fingers traced over the golden seal on the letter while his mind wandered to the stories he heard about Millbrook. Small town, tight-knit community on the surface, but underneath lay tension that reminded him of a pot about to boil over. That's exactly why he'd chosen this place over the cushier offers from bigger cities. Millbrook needed change, and Marcus knew he could make a difference. "You're doing that thing again." Sarah's voice pulled him from his thoughts. His wife of 25 years stood in the doorway, arms crossed, wearing that expression that meant she was worried but trying not to show it. "That thing where you carry the weight of the world on your shoulders." Marcus smiled, the kind of smile that started in his eyes before reaching his lips. "Come here," he said, patting his desk. Sarah walked over and perched on the edge, something she'd done countless times during their late-night talks about his cases. "I know that look too," she said, picking up the family photo from his desk, their wedding day, both of them laughing as they fed each other cake. "You're planning something." Marcus nodded, straightening his reading glasses. "I've been thinking about how to approach this. Millbrook's not like Portland or Seattle. It's stuck in its ways. If I walk in there on day one, throwing my weight around..." He shook his head. Sarah reached for his hand. "So what's the plan, Chief Richardson?" "I need to see it for myself first. No badge, no uniform. Just a man walking the streets of his new home." He squeezed her hand. "1 week of watching, learning, understanding the real Millbrook, not the one they'll show the new chief." "Marcus," Sarah's voice carried that note of concern he knew so well. "Be careful. Small towns have long memories and short tempers." He stood up, walking to the window. Outside, their grandson Tommy was chasing bubbles in the backyard, his laughter floating up to the second floor. "That's exactly why I need to do this, honey, for him. For every kid who looks like him." He turned back to Sarah. "Things don't change unless someone's brave enough to take the first step." Sarah joined him at the window, wrapping her arms around his waist. "Just promise me you'll be smart about it. You've always said the best officers think with their heads and feel with their hearts." Marcus chuckled, pulling her closer. 25 years, and you're still quoting me to myself." As the sun set over Portland, casting long shadows across their backyard, Marcus watched Tommy playing and thought about Millbrook. Sometimes the biggest changes started with the smallest steps. He faced down gang leaders, corrupt officers, and city politicians, but this quiet little town with its hidden problems might be his biggest challenge yet. And he was ready for it. The morning sun hadn't yet burned through Millbrook's early fog when Marcus stepped out of his temporary rental apartment. He'd chosen a simple place downtown, nothing fancy, just a basic spot where nobody would look twice at a new face. Wearing jeans, a plain blue sweater, and his old Detroit Tigers baseball cap, he looked like any other guy taking a morning walk. As he strolled down Main Street, the smell of fresh coffee from Clara's diner caught his attention. Perfect spot for some people watching. Through the window, he could see the morning crowd, construction workers grabbing breakfast, office folks hurrying with their to-go cups, and what looked like the regular crew of retirees solving the world's problems over endless coffee refills. "First time here?" the waitress asked, her name tag reading Jenny. She had that warm, small-town smile that made everyone feel like a regular. "That obvious, huh?" Marcus chuckled, sliding onto a stool at the counter. "Small town. We notice new faces," Jenny replied, already pouring him coffee without asking. "Passing through or staying a while?" Marcus wrapped his hands around the warm mug. "Thinking about making it home, actually, just getting a feel for the place first." As he sipped his coffee, 2 police cruisers pulled up outside, officers walked in, and Marcus watched how the atmosphere shifted. Some folks stiffened slightly, others suddenly found their plates fascinating. Jenny's smile became a little more forced as she served them. "The usual, boys?" she asked, her voice professional but lacking the warmth it had moments ago. Throughout the day, Marcus walked every neighborhood in Millbrook. He saw how Officer Thompson smiled and high-fived kids in the wealthy area near the lake, but barked orders at teenagers playing basketball in the predominantly black East Side. He noticed how patrol cars cruised slowly through certain neighborhoods but barely appeared in others. Outside the corner store on Sater Street, he watched an elderly black woman struggling with her groceries while two officers sat in their car across the street, too busy chatting to notice, or maybe choosing not to. Marcus helped her carry the bags to her door. "Bless you, young man," she said, patting his arm. "I'm Miss Martha. Been here 63 years, and some things change, some things don't." She glanced meaningfully at the police car. By late afternoon, Marcus had filled half a notebook with observations. He sat on a bench in the town square, watching kids play around the old fountain. A group of young black boys on bikes suddenly scattered when a patrol car rounded the corner, not because they were doing anything wrong, but because experience had taught them it was safer that way. His phone buzzed, a text from Sarah. "How's it going? Missing you and your terrible jokes." He smiled, typing back. "Town's beautiful on the surface. Underneath, there's work to be done." At the coffee shop where he stopped for an afternoon break, he overheard two officers talking about an upcoming community meeting. "Just another waste of time," one said. "They complain, we not, nothing changes." His partner laughed, and something in that laugh made Marcus's coffee taste bitter. As the day went down, Marcus stood on the bridge overlooking the river that split the town. On one side, beautiful historic homes with manicured lawns. On the other, modest houses with peeling paint but proud flower gardens. Same town, different worlds. An older man fishing off the bridge nodded at him. "Evening," he said. "You look like you're studying our town pretty hard." Marcus smiled, "Just trying to understand it." "Takes more than a day," the man replied, reeling in his line. "Some stories here run deep as this river." Walking back to his apartment in the growing dusk, Marcus thought about everything he'd seen. Tomorrow would bring more observations, more notes, more understanding. But already he knew, this wasn't just about changing policies or procedures. This was about changing hearts, changing minds, changing a culture that had taken root over generations. And somewhere in the back of his mind, he heard Sarah's voice. "Be careful." He had no idea just how right she was. The sun was setting over Riverside Park, painting the sky in shades of orange and purple. Marcus had spent the day watching kids play baseball at the community field, making mental notes about the clear divide in which families felt comfortable using which parts of the park. Now, as evening settled in, he decided to take one last walk before heading back to his temporary apartment. The sound of laughter and clinking bottles drifted from O'Malley's Bar and Grill, mixing with the chirping of crickets starting their nightly chorus. Marcus walked along the path that wound past the old oak trees, their branches creating long shadows in the dimming light. He'd seen 3 patrol cars parked outside O'Malley's earlier, off-duty officers unwinding after their shift. "Hey you," the sharp call cut through the evening quiet. "Hold up there." Marcus turned to see 3 men walking toward him, their strides confident and purposeful. Even in plain clothes, he recognized them instantly as cops. It was in their walk, their posture, the way they moved as a unit. The tallest one, broad-shouldered with a military-style haircut, led the group. "Evening," Marcus said calmly, his hands visible at his sides. 20 years of police work had taught him how quickly situations could escalate. "Don't remember seeing you around here before," the tall one said, getting closer. His breath smelled of beer, and his badge chain glinted under his collar. "Got some ID?" "Just taking a walk," Marcus replied. "Didn't know that was a crime in Millbrook." The second officer, shorter but stockier, circled behind him. "Getting smart with us, buddy?" "Not at all," Marcus kept his voice steady. "Just enjoying the park, same as anyone else." "Same as anyone else?" The tall one, whose name tag earlier at O'Malley's had read Conway, laughed without humor. "This time of night? In this part of the park?" Marcus knew what this was. He dealt with it his whole career, just usually from the other side of the badge. "I have every right to be here," he said firmly. That's when Conway stepped into his personal space, mere confidence mixing with something darker. "Rights? Let me tell you about rights in my town." Everything happened fast after that. A shove from behind made Marcus stumble forward. When he caught himself and turned, hands grabbed his arms. Despite his training, fighting back wasn't an option. It would only make things worse, and he knew it. "Think you can just walk anywhere you want?" Conway's voice had dropped to a dangerous whisper. Maybe we need to teach you how things work around here. They dragged him toward one of the park's light poles, his feet scraping against the gravel path. Marcus didn't resist. Not when they pulled his arms behind his back, not when the cold metal of handcuffs bit into his wrists, not even when they used zip ties to secure him to the pole. There, Conway stepped back, admiring their work. Now you can enjoy the park all night long. The third officer, who had been quiet until now, pulled out his phone and started taking pictures, all of them laughing. My buddy here's gonna post these. Conway smirked. Show everyone what happens when you don't know your place. Marcus looked each of them in the eye, memorizing faces, names on badge chains, every detail. He'd seen the darkness that could hide behind a badge before, but experiencing it firsthand was different. This wasn't about law or order. This was about power, about fear, about all the things he'd come to change. Night shift'll find you eventually, Conway called over his shoulder as they walked away, their laughter echoing through the park. Welcome to Millbrook. Standing there in the growing darkness, Marcus thought about Sarah's warming, about his grandson Tommy, about all the changes he needed to make. Tomorrow, these men would know exactly who they tied to this pole. But tonight, he was just another victim of the very system he was about to lead. The crickets kept chirping, the stars began to appear, and Marcus Richardson, the incoming chief of police, stood tied to a pole in his new town, planning exactly how he would turn this moment into the catalyst for change that Millbrook so desperately needed. Time moved differently when you were tied to a pole in the dark. Marcus watched the moon climb higher in the sky, its light casting strange shadows through the oak leaves. The evening had grown cooler, and his shoulders ached from the awkward position. Still, he remained calm, using his years of training to stay focused and alert. A couple walked by on the far path, too caught up in their conversation to notice him. He thought about calling out but decided against it. This moment, as uncomfortable as it was, would tell them more about his department than 100 interviews ever could. His mind drifted to his first day as a rookie cop, decades ago. His training officer had told him, the badge doesn't make the person, it reveals who they already are. Tonight had certainly revealed plenty about Conway and his friends. The zip ties bit into his wrists as he shifted his weight. From somewhere in the distance, he heard the church bells strike 10. Sarah would be worried by now. He promised to call her before bed, their nightly ritual even when apart. The thought of her made him smile despite everything. She'd be furious about this, but not surprised. Didn't I tell you to be careful? He could almost hear her saying. A rustling in the bushes caught his attention. A raccoon waddled out, looked at him curiously, then continued on its nightly foraging. At least you're not judging me, Marcus muttered, managing to find humor even in this situation. His phone buzzed in his pocket, probably Sarah again. The sound felt like it was mocking him, so close yet impossible to reach. The night air carried distant sounds, cars on the highway, a dog barking, the bass from O'Malley's where Conway and his buddies were probably still laughing about their joke. Finally, around 10:30, flashlight beams cut through the darkness. The night shift was doing their rounds. Hello, Marcus called out, his voice steady and clear. Over here by the light pole. Two officers approached cautiously, flashlights scanning. When they got closer, their expressions shifted from suspicion to shock. Oh my God, the younger officer, whose nameplate read Rodriguez, hurried forward. Sir, are you all right? What happened? The older officer, Mitchell, was already radioing for backup. Dispatch, we got a situation at Riverside Park. I'm fine, Marcus assured them as Rodriguez worked on the zip ties. Just had an interesting conversation with some of your colleagues. Sergeant Conway and his friends seemed to think this was appropriate entertainment for the evening. The officers exchanged worried glances. They knew Conway's reputation, but this was beyond anything they'd expected. As the zip ties finally gave way, Marcus rolled his shoulders, restoring circulation. Thank you, officers. I appreciate your professionalism. He pulled out his wallet, the one thing Conway's group hadn't bothered to check. Inside was his badge and ID, not from Portland, but his new credentials as Millbrook's chief of police. The color drained from both officers' faces as they read the ID. Rodriguez actually took a step back. Chief Richardson, but you weren't supposed to arrive until next week, officially. Marcus finished for him, his voice gentle but firm. I like to get to know a place first. Tonight has been educational. Mitchell looked like he'd swallowed something sour. Sir, we had no idea Conway would. Marcus held up a hand. You're not responsible for their actions, Officer Mitchell, but I would appreciate it if you keep this quiet until tomorrow's staff meeting. I think Sergeant Conway and his friends deserve to experience the full impact of their actions in front of their peers. As Marcus walked home that night, his wrists tender and his body tired, he wasn't angry. Anger wouldn't help him change things. Instead, he felt a deep determination. Tomorrow would be day one of a new era in the Millbrook Police Department, and Conway had just handed him the perfect opportunity to make his point. His phone buzzed again. This time he answered it. Hey honey, he said to Sarah. You're not going to believe the evening I've had. The Millbrook Police Department buzzed with morning energy. Officers gathered in the main conference room, coffee cups in hand, chatting about weekend plans and recent calls. Sergeant Conway stood near the back with his two friends from the previous night, sharing what they clearly thought was a hilarious story about their park encounter. Man, you should have seen his face. Conway chuckled, mimicking a distressed expression. Probably stayed there all night. The room was packed, morning shift arriving, night shift not yet gone. Perfect. Every single officer would witness what was about to happen. Captain Stevens, currently the highest-ranking officer present, cleared his throat at the podium. All right, everyone. Settle down. As you know, today we're meeting our new chief. He comes highly recommended from Portland with 20 years of experience. The door at the back of the room opened quietly. A few heads turned, then more. The casual chatter died like someone had hit a mute button. Conway, still grinning from his story, hadn't noticed yet. Marcus walked to the front of the room, his shoes clicking against the floor in the dead silence. He wore his full-dress uniform, every button gleaming, every crease perfect. The bruises on his wrists were hidden by his sleeves, but he could still feel them, a reminder of why this moment mattered so much. Thank you, Captain Stevens, Marcus said, his voice carrying to every corner of the room. He turned to face his new department, letting his eyes meet each officer's gaze. When he reached Conway and his friends, he held their stare a moment longer. The blood drained from Conway's face so fast he actually swayed a little. His two companions looked like they might be sick. Someone in the room whispered, "Oh, shit." Good morning, Marcus continued, his voice perfectly calm. I'm Chief Marcus Richardson. Some of you had the chance to meet me last night, though I wasn't wearing this uniform at the time. He picked up a small remote from the podium and clicked it. The screen behind him lit up with the photos Conway's friend had taken. Marcus tied to the pole, the officers laughing beside him. The images were crisp, their badges clearly visible. Conway had been too busy posting them online to realize they were evidence. A collective gasp filled the room. Several officers stepped away from Conway's group like they were contagious. Captain Stevens looked like he was about to faint. Now, Marcus said, still in that calm voice, we could spend this morning talking about policies, procedures, and my plans for the department. Instead, let's discuss what these photos tell us about who we are and who we need to become. He walked closer to Conway, who seemed to be trying to disappear into the wall. Sergeant Conway, you and your friends taught me something valuable last night. You showed me exactly why I chose Millbrook. This department doesn't just need new policies, it needs a complete change of heart. The silence in the room was absolute. Even the usual morning traffic noise seemed muted, as if the world outside was holding its breath. Some of you might be expecting me to fire these officers on the spot, Marcus continued, addressing the whole room, to make an example of them, but that's the easy way out. Instead, they're going to help me demonstrate how this department can transform itself, how we can turn ignorance into understanding, hatred into hope. He turned back to the screen, to the damning photos. As of this moment, all 3 officers involved are suspended pending investigation, but their path back to active duty will involve more than just paperwork. They're going to help me build the bridge between this department and the community they disrespected last night. Marcus looked around the room one final time, seeing the shock, shame, and in some faces, the first glimmer of hope for real change. Welcome to the new Millbrook Police Department, he said. Let's get to work. The morning sunlight streamed through the windows, cutting through the tension like a knife through darkness. In that light, every officer in the room could see the future clearly. Things in Millbrook would never be the same again. 2 weeks after the incident, Marcus sat in his office reviewing Conway's file. The local paper's headline sat on his desk: Police Chief Transforms Assault into Teaching Moment. He'd been getting calls from departments across the country, but his focus remained on the 3 suspended officers and their path forward. A knock on his door interrupted his thoughts. Conway stood there, looking different from that night in the park. Humbler, the arrogance gone from his stance. "Chief, you wanted to see me?" "Come in, James," Marcus said, using Conway's first name deliberately. "Have a seat." He gestured to the chair across from his desk. "How are those community service hours going?" Conway shifted uncomfortably. "Just finished my shift at Miss Martha's community garden. She makes sure we work hard, but she also makes amazing lemonade." Marcus smiled, remembering the elderly woman he helped with groceries. She jumped at the chance to supervise the officers' community service hours. "She has a way of teaching without preaching, doesn't she?" "Yesterday," Conway said, staring at his hands, "she showed me photos of her grandfather. He was a police officer too, back in the 60s. One of the first black officers in the state, the stories she told me." He paused, struggling with words. "I never thought about how things looked from the other side." "That's exactly why you're spending time there," Marcus said, pulling out a folder. "Now, about your reinstatement program. I've designed something special for you and your colleagues." He handed Conway a document. "You'll be working with the youth center in East Millbrook. 3 days a week, you'll help run their after-school program. These are kids who've grown up seeing police as the enemy. You're going to help change that." Conway looked up, surprised. "You're trusting me with kids? After what I did?" "The question is, James, can you trust yourself to be the kind of officer they need?" Marcus leaned forward. "I'm not punishing you. I'm giving you a chance to rebuild yourself from the ground up." The office fell quiet except for the gentle hum of the air conditioning. Outside, they could hear the everyday sounds of the station. Phones ringing, officers talking, life going on. "My partner in Portland," Marcus continued, "was a lot like you once. Thought he knew everything about everyone. Then he got assigned to coach a youth basketball team in the neighborhood he used to profile. By the end of that year, he was a different person. Those kids changed him more than any sensitivity training ever could." Conway studied the document, reading about his new assignments: youth mentoring, community meetings, riding along with Officer Rodriguez to learn his approach to community policing. "This is going to be hard," he admitted. "Growth usually is," Marcus replied. "But here's the thing about changed games: it ripples outward. Every kid you connect with as family, friends, neighbors. Every positive interaction creates a wave of possibility." Standing up, Marcus walked to the window overlooking the station parking lot. "You know what I see out there? I see officers greeting people instead of intimidating them. I see your colleagues starting to question old habits. That started with you, believe it or not. Your mistake became everyone's wake-up call." Conway stood too, squaring his shoulders. "I won't let you down, Chief." "This isn't about me," Marcus corrected gently. "This is about the badge we wear, the people we serve, and the person you want to be when you look in the mirror each morning." As Conway left the office, Marcus saw Officer Rodriguez waiting to take him to the youth center. The young officer had become an unexpected ally in the department's transformation, eagerly sharing his community policing techniques with others. Marcus picked up the newspaper again, smiling at the headline. Sometimes the worst moments led to the best changes. His phone buzzed, a text from Sarah. "Miss Martha says Conway actually has a green thumb. Who knew?" Change was happening in Millbrook, one garden, one basketball game, one conversation at a time, and it was happening because he'd chosen to transform an act of hatred into an opportunity for growth. 6 months passed like a whirlwind in Millbrook. On a bright Saturday morning, Marcus watched from the bleachers as Conway showed a group of kids proper basketball shooting technique at the East Side Youth Center. The same kids who used to run at the sight of a police car were now high-fiving an officer. "He's got away with them, doesn't he?" Sarah said, sitting next to Marcus with 2 cups of coffee from the community center's weekend breakfast program. She handed one to him, steam rising in the cool morning air. "Never would have believed it 6 months ago," Marcus replied, accepting the coffee. He watched as Conway got down on one knee to tie a little girl's shoelace. Remember when he couldn't even look me in the eye? The youth center had become the heart of their changes. What started as Conway's redemption assignment had grown into something bigger. Officers now regularly volunteered here, not because they had to, but because they wanted to. "Chief," a voice called out. Marcus turned to see Tommy, a 13-year-old who'd once been caught spraying graffiti on the station walls. Now he helped run the center's peer mentoring program. "Officer Conway's teaching us about the junior cadet program. Can I sign up?" Marcus smiled. "Come by the station on Monday. We'll get you the forms." Across the gym, Officer Rodriguez was setting up for today's community meeting. These gatherings had changed too. Gone were the tense, accusatory sessions. Now people brought food, shared stories, and actually talked to each other. "Chief," Conway called out, jogging over. His face was flushed from the exercise, but his eyes were bright. "Remember that idea we discussed, about the police community basketball league? The one where officers and kids play on mixed teams?" Marcus nodded. "Well, the parents' committee approved it. We're starting next month." Conway grinned, then grew serious. "You know, when you first assigned me here, I thought it was punishment. But these kids," he shook his head, searching for words. "They taught me more than I could ever teach them." Sarah squeezed Marcus's hand. She knew this moment meant more than just a basketball program. It was proof that people could change when given the chance. The community center doors opened, and more families started arriving for the meeting. Miss Martha came in, carrying her famous lemonade. She'd become something of a grandmother figure to the whole department, especially to Conway and his friends. "James Conway," she called out, "don't forget you're helping with the garden after the meeting. Those tomatoes won't plant themselves." "Yes, ma'am," Conway replied with a genuine smile. The man who'd once tied someone to a pole for fun now spent his free weekends helping an elderly woman tend her community garden. During the meeting, Marcus watched his officers interact with the community. Rodriguez was showing an elderly man how to use the department's new online reporting system. Officer Chen, who'd once been Conway's silent partner that night in the park, was now leading a discussion about starting a neighborhood watch program. "The thing is," Chen was saying, "we're not here to police the community. We're here to be part of it." Marcus felt Sarah lean against his shoulder. "You get this," she whispered. But he shook his head. "No, they did this. All of them. I just showed them it was possible." After the meeting, as families lingered to chat with officers over coffee and Miss Martha's lemonade, Marcus stood by the window. Outside, the basketball court was full of kids playing with officers. The walls that once divided them were coming down, one brick at a time. Tommy ran past with his friends, wearing a junior cadet t-shirt Conway had given him. "See you Monday, Chief," he called out. Conway appeared beside Marcus, watching the scene. "You know what's funny, Chief? That night in the park, I thought I was teaching you a lesson about power. Turns out you taught us all something about leadership instead." Marcus smiled. The transformation wasn't complete. Change never is. But looking around the community center, seeing officers and citizens talking, laughing, and planning together, he knew Millbrook was becoming what he'd always believed it could be. Not just a department in its town, but a community working together. The town hall was packed for the community forum, with people spilling out into the hallway. Marcus stood at the back, watching faces both familiar and new. A year ago, these meetings were battlegrounds. Tonight felt more like a family gathering. Mrs. Johnson, whose son had been routinely stopped for suspicious behavior before Marcus arrived, was now leading the Civilian Oversight Committee. She stood at the podium, reviewing the year's progress. "Last year, we had 43 complaints about officer conduct," she announced. "This quarter, just 3, and 2 of those were about parking tickets." Gentle laughter rippled through the crowd. Marcus spotted Tommy in the front row, proudly wearing his junior cadet uniform. Next to him sat Conway, who'd become the boy's mentor. Who would have thought the officer who once embodied everything wrong with the department would become one of its strongest advocates for change? "Remember when people used to cross the street when they saw us coming?" Rodriguez whispered to Chen, standing nearby. "Now they wave us down just to chat." The presentation continued with photos from recent community events. The police youth basketball tournament, where Conway's team had made it to the finals. The Community Garden Harvest Festival, where officers and residents worked side by side. The new Coffee with a Cop program at Clara's Diner. Now so popular they had to rotate officers to meet demand. Chief. Mrs. Johnson called out, "Would you mind saying a few words?" As Marcus walked to the podium, he remembered his first week in Millbrook, the tensions, the fear, that night in the park. The memory of being tied to that pole could have been bitter, but instead, it had become a reminder of how far they'd come. A year ago, he began, I came to Millbrook as a stranger, wanting to understand this community before taking command. What I learned in that first week wasn't easy to face, for any of us. Conway shifted in his seat but didn't look away. They'd moved past shame to understanding. But here's what I've learned since then, Marcus continued. Real change doesn't come from policies or procedures alone. It comes from people willing to look at themselves honestly and choose to be better. He gestured to the photos on display. Every smile in these pictures, every handshake, every moment of trust, that's not just about better policing. It's about becoming better neighbors. Miss Martha stood up slowly, her garden-worn hands gripping her cane. Chief Richardson, may I say something? Of course, Miss Martha. You've earned that right with all the lemonade you've shared. Marcus smiled, stepping aside. I've lived here 64 years now, she began, her voice strong despite her age. Seen the good times and the bad. But what I see now, my grandfather, who wore the badge when most folks didn't want him to, would be proud. Not just of the changes, but of how we made them, together. She turned to Conway and his fellow officers. These boys who used to swagger around like they owned the streets, now they're helping our children grow. That's what real power looks like. The room fell quiet, letting her words sink in. Then Tommy raised his hand. Can I say something too? Marcus nodded, and Tommy stood, nervous but determined. Last year, I used to run when I saw police cars. Now, he looked at Conway. Now I want to be an officer, because I've seen what it really means to protect and serve. The meeting ended with people lingering, sharing stories and plans for future projects. Marcus watched as Conway helped Miss Martha with her coat, as Rodriguez joked with the teens he used to view with suspicion, as Chen discussed the upcoming community safety workshop with former critics. Sarah appeared at his side, slipping her hand into his. You're smiling that smile again, she said. What smile is that? The one that says you're watching your dream come true. Marcus squeezed her hand, taking in the scene before them. Millbrook hadn't just changed its police department, it had changed its heart. And that was something worth smiling about. 1 year to the day after the incident in the park, Marcus stood in the same spot where he'd once been tied to a pole. But this time, he wasn't alone. Conway stood beside him, both men watching as Parks Department workers installed a new community bulletin board. Hard to believe it was right here, Conway said quietly, running his hand along the light pole. Sometimes I wake up thinking about that night, about how different things could have gone. Life's funny that way, Marcus replied. One moment can change everything, for better or worse. It's what you do with that moment that matters. The sound of children's laughter drifted across the park. The playground, once nearly empty because parents didn't feel safe letting their kids play there, was now full of life. Officers Rodriguez and Chen were teaching bicycle safety to a group of eager youngsters, their patrol cars parked nearby with lights flashing just for fun. Sarah approached with Miss Martha, both carrying baskets for the park's first annual community picnic. Behind them, a stream of people carried food, blankets, and folding chairs. The whole town seemed to be turning out. Chief, Tommy called out, running up in his junior cadet uniform. The news crew is here. They want to interview us about the changes in Millbrook. Marcus had been getting a lot of calls lately. Other departments wanted to know how they'd done it, how they turned a moment of darkness into a catalyst for real change. The story had spread beyond their small town, becoming a model for other communities struggling with similar issues. You know what they asked me? Conway said, helping Miss Martha set up her famous lemonade stand. They wanted to know if I was ashamed of those photos from that night. I told them I keep one in my locker. Not to remind me of what I did, but to remind me of who I never want to be again. The picnic grew larger as more people arrived. Officers mingled with residents, not as authority figures but as neighbors. Kids played tag around the trees, their parents chatting nearby without the tension that used to define these interactions. Mrs. Johnson from the Oversight Committee arrived with her son, now a part-time dispatcher at the station. "Chief," she called out, "we just got the latest community survey results. 92% say they trust the police department now. Last year, it was 28%. Marcus watched as Conway gathered his youth basketball team for a quick game. These kids, who once feared the police, now crowded around their coach, eager for his attention. "Numbers are good," Marcus said, "but that right there, that's the real change." As the afternoon sun began to set, Marcus took the microphone for a brief speech. The same park that had witnessed one of his darkest moments was now filled with hope and community. "A year ago," he began, "something happened in this park that could have divided us further. Instead, it brought us together. Not because we ignored the problem, but because we faced it head-on. Every person here, officers and citizens alike, chose to be part of the solution." He gestured to Conway and his fellow officers. These men could have let their mistakes define them. Instead, they let their mistakes refine them. They showed us that change isn't just possible, it's inevitable when we open our hearts to it. Looking out at the gathered crowd, Marcus saw everything he'd hoped for when he first came to Millbrook. Officers playing with kids, elderly residents feeling safe in their park again, teenagers chatting casually with police instead of running away. "This isn't the end of our story," he concluded. "It's just the beginning, because real change isn't a destination. It's a journey we take together, one step at a time." As the sun set over Millbrook Park, casting long shadows from the same pole that had once symbolized division, the sound of laughter and conversation filled the air. Conway's basketball game had turned into an impromptu tournament, with officers and kids on mixed teams. Miss Martha's lemonade was flowing freely, and Sarah was taking pictures of everything. Marcus felt a tug on his sleeve. Tommy stood there, holding his junior cadet badge. "Chief," he said seriously, "think I could be like you someday?" Marcus looked around at his transformed community, at Conway coaching kids, at Rodriguez teaching bike safety, at Chen helping serve food to elderly residents. At all of them, changed by choice and commitment. "No, Tommy," he said with a smile, "I think you'll be even better." And in that moment, under the same stars that had witnessed his humiliation a year ago, Marcus Richardson knew that sometimes the worst moments could lead to the best changes, if you were brave enough to believe in the possibility of transformation.